I'm probably jumping the gun a bit here, but I'm thinking about this Berman book, Coming to Our Senses, or Coming to the Senses, which is the next on the reading list for the reading group that Professor Anton has set up, and he hasn't really started the reading of that book yet, which is why I say I'm probably jumping the gun. But I've been thinking about it recently because it's in relation actually to Douglas Harding, who I've mentioned before in a few videos. And the reason why I mention him in this context is that one of the first pages of the Berman book has a quotation from Douglas Harding. Douglas Harding is a mystic who died about 5 years ago, kind of mystic, who writes about non-dual states of consciousness, I suppose, and draws a lot on the Western mystical tradition and Zen traditions actually to explain that. But he features in the Berman book because the way Harding talks about it is very similar in some ways. They've got a lot of overlap to certain aspects of phenomenology, existential phenomenology, and to some of the things that's talked about at the beginning of that book, particularly to do with mirrors, which I won't really go into now. But the thing I'm interested in right now, in terms of, I'm sort of coming out of that, I suppose, is about this kind of self-other discontinuity and how it figures within, or how Berman talks about it a bit, and how Douglas Harding talks about it. I mean, when Douglas Harding's talking about it, he's coming from, as I say, from a kind of mystical tradition, or he's making gestures towards that tradition, and observing that here we are in this, what you might call a kind of fallen state, where we're slightly detached from nature, experientially. We know intellectually that we are part of nature and continuous with it, but it doesn't feel like that. It feels quite often that we are slightly detached from it, that we're cast into a world that existed before we were born, that we spend our whole life kind of locked inside our bodies and kind of looking out at our bodies a bit like that little creature that lives inside the body of that person in the Men in Black film. So we have this constant experience, this intentional flow comes out of our eyes, so we look out into the world and we listen to the world as if our hearing is flowing out of our ears. So we have all this this kind of experience as if we're a passenger in our own bodies, engaging with the world which is separate from us, and which our body, and particularly in Harding, our head, is the kind of liminal surface. In Harding, the head features a lot, and he's kind of drawing on this idea that, you know, we have this head, it's got this brain inside it, and the brain is where the consciousness is. This is how we feel it. And then outside the head is where the world is, and the head, with all of its sensory organs, and particularly the eyes, are the portals through which the brain and the consciousness sees the world. So that's the basic duality in material form that Harding alludes to. And what he's talking about is, the value, the potential value at least, in kind of eliding that, kind of getting past that duality, and getting past that feeling that there are two things in the world, there's us and then there's the world. And he tries to do that by taking on this very basic material fact that we have a head, and inside that head is a brain, and outside that head is the world, and that's the complete reality. And he does this really simply, and it sounds naive and stupid to talk about it. He does this by reminding us of what it's like to actually be alive and awake in the world, and what kind of visual experiences we're having. He's talking about, we see the world, we see these trees, we see these dogs, we see the ground under our feet, we see our bodies, we see our arms, but we don't see our heads. Our heads never feature on the landscape of our visual world at all, actually. In fact, if you kind of do this thing where you look up your body, and this is an exercise that Harding used to do when he was alive, when you look up your body, the visual field just kind of turns into the world, if you like. And there's a series of exercises which flow out of that observation, which use that the visual unavailability of one's own head to kind of forget that you've got a head. And if you forget your head, then obviously the separation between the inside of that head, the brain, and the outside of that head, the world, disappears. And you can kind of come to realise that, come to intuit that, and it starts to feel more logical that the self and world are inseparable. That's the idea of it, at least. Well, the reason why I'm talking about that in relation to Maurice Berman is he's talking about, a little bit at least, about, in the early parts of the book, about a phenomenon called confiscation. He's referring to somebody else. But confiscation is like the downside of that experience. Because if you've got this kind of self-world or self-other division, which is part of the human condition, you know, we're natural-born dualists, as Paul Bloom says. We are kind of, that's just how it presents itself. Then yes, if you do it right and you dissolve this in a kind of mystical way to get this state of non-dual advaita, or whatever you want to call it, that's very nice. But that's not the only possible thing that could happen. Another thing that could happen is this confiscation thing, where the boundaries between self and other break down, not the literal boundary of the head, of the skull, but the kind of ontological boundaries between self and other break down. But instead of feeling this golden glow of extended consciousness where you are the world, etc., you feel yourself being absorbed or being taken over or being invaded. So you might feel the presence of alien others inside yourself. You might feel yourself literally confiscated, literally taken away. So you might experience that symptomatically as voices, or you might feel yourself as being controlled, or you might just not feel that you own yourself anymore. And those are quite kind of frightening experiences. The other downside, which I don't think Berman does talk about, is the possibility of that other self-world separation breaking down, but instead of there being no flow of intentionality, one just feels one's intentionality extend. So you get this unreasonable sense of control. I think we all get this at times. So you start to feel that the events in the outside, you get a bit paranoid, to be honest, and a bit grandiose. You start to think that your thoughts are controlling the world, or you start to think that you're able to influence things outside of your body. I mean, when my kids were little, I used to take them to amusement arcades, and if I was feeling really cheap, I'd just stand them in front of machines which were running on demo mode, and they'd quite happily just play with the controls, completely convinced that they were steering these cars or making these guys fight or whatever it was. I guess because I guess all of us have that sense of control, but taken to a kind of pathological level, that's again a symptom of that same breakdown of self and other. It's not a confiscation; it's the kind of opposite of that, really, in which one feels oneself confiscating the world from other people or from inanimate forces. So you just get this unreasonable sense of control. That's why I've wandered about a bit there. But all I'm saying is really that there's this self-other distinction, which Maurice Berman talks about, and which Douglas Harding talks about in terms of enlightenment and the pursuit of non-duality. Also has various downsides in terms of confiscation, in terms of the kind of paranoid delusions potential flowing out of that. Yeah, that's it.